Ahavas quotes a verse in Mishlei where Shlomo Melech, he speaks about a person who's lazy. And naturally, a person, there's a certain, we discuss inertia. And because it's inertia, people always procrastinate. Unless it's something you really want to do, you let things slide, go to the wayside. And Shlomo says in Mishlei, he says, Al sodi ish otze lovarti. He says, I passed by a field of a person who was lazy. What is the ramification? A person is lazy, doesn't take care of the field. And the field is filled with briars and with weeds and with something which is what? Which has no value due to the neglect of the field. Meaning, if you don't cultivate the field and seed it as it should, what grows? Everything which is what? Which is not only has no value, it actually undermines the quality of the field. In addition, the Ged Avon of Nerso and the protective wall, which is made of stones, eventually goes into disrepair. So not only is the field itself, because the owner of the field doesn't tend to it, he doesn't check on the stability of the fence. So eventually the fence also becomes breached. So the field is filled with weeds and briars and stones. And eventually the fence which protects the field is also breached. Now, quotes the Gemara tells us that four things need a continuously strengthening. What are they? Torah. Once Torah study has to be continuously shored up. You have to reflect on its value. Now, very often, there's an expression, people rest on their laurels. They rest on laurels. Person has knowledge more than most people. He doesn't feel the urgency to study more. You know more than all. And especially you've studied today. So if I study today, should I study more, although I have more time to study? So there are many reasons why a person, although it's the best interest of a person to study, because the more he studies, not only is knowledge-wise, but he's continuously infusing himself with what? With something of a spiritual nature. You're upgrading, you're advancing, spiritually speaking. We'll explain this in a moment. So a person, we rest on our laurels, and even if we know there's more to do, we feel it could wait. But while we delay and allow that vacuum to develop, what starts developing? You have what? You have weeds start growing, briars start growing. The earth is not being cultivated. It's not being sown. Secondly, if you don't attend to that, there's an expression of a person gets out of shape. What happens when you're out of shape? If you haven't exercised in a while, and you don't, before you start exercising, do certain, what they call warm-up, what happens? Your muscles are not flexible, and you can actually you have an injury. The muscle doesn't function correctly. Person's always using his muscle, the muscle is always flexible, and the moment you engage for a short period of time, it fully functions and advances. But if you leave the muscle, sometimes it even atrophies. Even doesn't atrophy, if you apply any pressure to it, you're going to incur an injury. It's the same thing with a person. The lazy person doesn't go attend to the needs of the field. Firstly, instead of sowing and cultivating it, weeds grow, briars grow. And because you're not there, the fence eventually goes into disrepair. And even when you want to, afterwards, weed out the weeds, but you realize if you don't fix the fence, you have all kinds of animals coming in there, and they destroy whatever you try to accomplish. So your positive input becomes wasted because it becomes futile. Rashi, when he speaks about Torah needs chizuk, he speaks about a person who's a well-weathered warrior, soldier. His reflexes have to be literally up on par, because even without thinking, when he's attacked, he knows exactly, reflexively, he responds. But if you have any moment of hesitation, what happens? That hesitation costs the soldier his life. So a person who's in the loop, so to say, you study day in and day out, and you have a sense of many things due to you being in so-called in shape. You have certain sensitivities, and because of those sensitivities, you're able to have a certain sense that something's coming down the pike, and you're able to deflect it. But if you're not, your senses aren't honed to that point, you become vulnerable to many things because you don't have those sensitivities to sense what's within your proximity, and you become a victim of that. Very often, sometimes I walk down the street with a person and I don't notice things, and the other person does notice things. And there's certain times I notice things and the other person doesn't notice things. And the person says to me, didn't you see that? I said, no, I didn't see it. I said, what are you talking about? And he points out something which is inappropriate. I said, I didn't notice it. And then I say, did you see it? Did you notice it? He says, no. So I said to him, why did you notice certain things I don't notice, and I notice things you don't notice? The answer is very simple. Because when you see certain things, subconsciously, you're looking for certain things. And when you're looking for things, and when they come on the so-called within your purview, you notice it immediately. But if you're not looking for those things, and you're not into those things, you just gloss over it. And other things, which I see to be detrimental, and you have to deflect it, and you have to avoid it, I notice it. He doesn't notice it. Why? Because that's part of his sphere. Because that's what he normally sees. He doesn't see it in that negative. Doesn't have that negative connotation and that negative level of representation. That's why I see things which he doesn't see, and he sees things which I don't notice for that reason. The Gemara tells us that in the time of Avraham Avinu, there was a certain nation called Chori, and they were agriculturists. They could put their nose to the ground and smell the earth, and they knew exactly what type of seed to plant in that earth. That's how they were in touch with the earth. That's such a sense. They knew exactly the potential and what should be planted, what should not be planted. I mean, how did they have hone such skills? Or a person notices things. He's able to track. He knows whether somebody was there or wasn't there. The eye is trained. You have a sense. Senses don't come by themselves. It's all part of training and upbringing and in a continuous involvement. Identically, he says something phenomenal. The body itself, the physical component of a human being, if you give it sufficient nourishment, you hydrate it, and you exercise it, what happens? It becomes stronger. Good things happen in the physical sense. You have a certain degree of stamina, endurance, mentally, emotionally, physically, because your physicality is healthy. You sleep sufficiently, you eat right, you exercise right, everything's right. What happens if you let things go to the wayside? Then the body starts failing. The potential, what the body could develop, become, the mind dulls, the body atrophies, and the energy is not there. He says something's phenomenal. He says the neshama of a Jew, the soul, is the exact same thing. God gave us a diet. It's called mitzvos, commandments. You infuse it with the positive commandment. You infuse it with Torah. It has a tremendous potential. Tremendous things could grow from that soul. If you nourish that soul, you infuse it correctly, it becomes something which is magnificent. It surpasses all limits. And what happens if you cross certain lines, which are called transgressions? Then you're destroying the soul, exactly with the body. So it's a parallel. Just as the body, if you nourish it and nurture it as you should, it grows, develops, and becomes stronger, and becomes more capable, has a greater capacity, identity of the soul. The soul is all potential. And if you address its potential, and God gave us the nourishment to develop its potential, therefore, and what is that? That's Torah. Torah is what? Is the antidote. It gives you, certain people that take certain vitamins for their eyesight. How do you see the machinations of the evil inclination? How do you pick up on it? What is the night glasses that even though it's pitch dark, you're able to see through all the darkness? It's called Torah. The Torah gives you that sense that although visually you don't see it, you sense, and you see it in the light, which you want to stay away from it. It's exactly, so the body and the soul actually are paralleled. Just as the body responds positively, negatively to certain things, identically the neshama responds positively and negatively. If you nurture it, it grows, advances. You develop senses. And if you leave it fallow, what is it? Not only does it not advance, it actually withers. Because it needs that invigoration, it needs that infusion of what? Of spiritual nourishment, which is called Torah mitzvahs. That's the Chofetz Chaim. Knowing that, if God forbid a person has a stroke, and you have to have physical therapy, it doesn't come easy. It's painful. But eventually, if you want to regain your function, you have to go through the course of physical therapy. And you have to get a good physical therapist. And you have to be regimented. And it is a regiment. Identically, Torah is the same thing. A human being, a Jew specifically, needs ongoing therapy. Because we have naturally we have negative tendencies. It's called inclinations. We have to actually spiritualize the physicality of the body, which is inclined not to what? To be inclined to do spiritual things. It's a conditioning process. But this conditioning process works that if you address it correctly, the body naturally will respond. Since not only the soul, the body will have a sense and gravitate to things which are more spiritual. You're able to spiritualize the physicality of the person. I'll give you an example. Person studies Torah, and person is conditioned to study. And you see, when he studies, he's having experience of euphoria. He has a tremendous sense of joy. He's satisfied. He's happy. And he's alert. Another person reads those same words. After one word, he's had enough. Why? What's the difference? Why one person? Oh well, you're a provincial Jew. You're from an archaic, historic period, so you think that's what it's all about. Has nothing to do with that. It's because one person, his soul is the primary factor, and it's actually affected his physicality. So when other people experience joy and pleasure doing other things in the physical, this person enjoys by utilizing the physical to facilitate the spiritual. It's a different reality. We just read about the Akedah, which Avram was told to bring his son that was born to him in his old age as a sacrifice. Avram is the founding patriarch of the Jewish people. He introduced monotheism to the world. He was willing to die for it. They threw him into a kiln. He came out alive. He took on the world single-handedly. He's told at the age of 137 to bring his son as a sacrifice. The son that he waited all his life for, who he loved, who he mentored, to be the future. God says, it's time to bring him as a sacrifice. What does the Torah tell us? The next morning, Avram rises early in the morning. And what does he do? He hitches his own donkey to go do the will of God. You know, person has to do something. You have no choice. You drag yourself out of bed. You barely can get out of bed because it's something you don't want to do because you love your son. And he's asking you to do something which you waited all your life for, and now you're going to give it up. And it's plus much more complicated than that. God said he's the future. Now God says there is no future. And you rise early, and from this we learn that a Jew, when the mitzvah presents itself, you should do it with zeal and alacrity, not to let a moment pass. He rose with a tremendous energy. To do what? To do the will of God. But the will of God is contrary to what you want. When it's contrary to what you want, it's like pushing a boulder up a mountain. And the boulder is a lot heavier than your strength, than your capacity. What happens? You get crushed by the boulder. And Avram, although seemingly this would be contrary to what he would want, definitely not what he wants, not only does he get out of bed, he rises early. That soon enough is not soon enough. And not only that, he doesn't wait for his servants and slaves to hitch his donkey. He hitches it himself because he can't wait. Does that make sense? You're going to slaughter your son because God said so. You love your son. He was born to your old age. He's a miracle child. So how do you go rise early and do it with such energy, with such zeal, that you can't wait till it happens? He's going on the way to the Akedah. He's confronted with a raging river, which is Satan coming as a raging river. What does he say to God? I'm drowning. I want to do your will. They don't let me do your will. If we would have been confronted with such a situation, what would we say? I tried. I can't. I'm going home. We'd find the first opportunity to go back home. Avram doesn't say that. Avram says, I want to do your will. I can't. I'm drowning. Allow me to do your will. Where's Avram coming from? Where's Avram coming from? Where are we coming from? Because Avram was able to understand on every level the value of doing God's will. And because Avram was able to internalize that reality, his level of motivation was something not to be understood. Who rises early to slaughter his son. He hitches his donkey because it's not soon enough to be able to do the will of God. And where's he going? It's a 3-day trek. From when he left till he arrived, it was 3 days he was traveling. He could have changed his mind 25 times. He'd say maybe initially he didn't think. It was on the moment. And therefore he behaved irrationally. He had plenty of time to reflect on it. He could have gone back many times. He just kept going. Wasn't going to stop. Why not? Because Avram understood what we don't understand. We understand cerebrally we understand. But within our emotion, within our physicality, within our energy level, we're not attuned. We're not wired the way Avram was wired. But why was he wired differently? It didn't come out of a vacuum. Growing in Judaism is a lifetime process. I once said to someone, to give it up, it takes a second. To develop, to have it, it's a lifetime. You know, it's interesting. Person lives a life, he's educated, raised, tremendous amount of effort is put into him as a human being. Then he decides he's going to take his life and he walks off a roof. How long did it take for him to develop to the point where whatever he was, his capacity, his potential was developed? It's a whole lifetime. How long does it take for him to end his life? One moment. One irresponsible action ends his life in a moment. It's the exact same thing. To develop that special level of spirituality, that it should become almost like second nature, and it builds on itself, it's a lifetime. Every day is a new degree of what? Of accomplishment. And it builds on it. And it intensifies. And you soar, and you advance, and you have levels of understanding which you didn't have. But if a person chooses in a moment to give it up, it's over. Rambam says that a person can be a tzaddik all his life, and the last moment before he dies is, I regret all the good I ever did in my life. The record is immediately obliterated. When he passes away, there will not be a trace of any of the goodness, any mitzvah that he did in his lifetime. So how long does it take to create, and how long does it take to wipe out, to literally to eradicate? A moment. Don't you think the evil inclination was created to be the challenge of life? It's a challenge. God forbid he could throw you a curveball, that curveball could throw you off the cliff. When you go to catch it, the ball going over the back fence, you could also go over the back fence, and you go off the cliff if you're too close to the edge. And he understands that. That's what it is at risk. And you have to understand that. So anything we do, you have to first reflect and understand the ramifications of your action. Sometimes we believe something's a mitzvah, and he convinced you it's a mitzvah. It's not such a mitzvah. Somebody convinced you to go to a certain location to deliver or do a good deed, but the person didn't tell you it's a war zone. So when you're delivering that package to feed someone, you're in the war zone, you understand. It's very questionable whether you're going to return. The evil inclination can convince you something is a good deed, but that good deed could actually end your life, at least spiritually. There's an expression in the olden days, you wouldn't hear it today. At one time they had chimney sweepers. You ever see a picture of a chimney sweeper? It wasn't a photograph, it was a painting. A chimney sweeper, what did he do? He had like a long broom. He'd go on the chimney and he'd sweep out all the soot of the chimney. So the chimney sweeper made the chimney clean. But what did he look like? He was covered with soot from head to toe. He looked totally black with soot. He may clean other things, but he's blackened. Sometimes we go and we want to help others, but sometimes you may help another person slightly, but what you expose yourself to by trying to help, ultimately you become totally flawed. You become influenced because you don't belong there. There's an expression, you got to pick your battles. If you could fight the fight is one thing. And even if you can fight the fight, you have to understand how you're going to come out of that fight. How beaten up are you going to be? How wounded are you going to be? What is the cost of that fight? It's too costly, you don't get involved in that fight. It's the same thing with our spirituality. We talk about Kiruv. Bring other Jews back to Judaism. If you're not really conditioned and qualified and have the knowledge base, you may enter into a dialogue with someone, which though that person's back and forth may cast questions and put doubts in your mind about God's existence. And you may see things differently. And if that's the case, you have no right to get involved in that conversation. Because nobody's saying anybody's the smartest person in the world. And to get involved with a challenge where you may not be able to meet that challenge, either you could, but certain points may be pointed out, which will have a negative effect on your belief, you have no right to go there. But the other person is going to know more than he knows now. But the question is, what are you going to be a victim of this? You're not permitted to put yourself in the position that you can be a victim. That you're not permitted. But that's all part of the challenge and the evil inclination. God wants one thing, At the end of the day, you should win the game. That you come in from third base, you come into home plate. That's what God wants. If you don't make it to the goalpost and you try and you take risks, God doesn't want you to take risks. There's enough to accomplish and to advance where you're protected. You put on certain protective gear. You observe fences. You make evaluations. The times you pray for clarity. Very often when you study and you work on something the day before and you try to figure it out, you can't figure it out. Next morning, you approach the same subject matter. You spend 5 minutes, you understand it immediately. So you could say, very often, the night before, you were too fatigued. And your mind you didn't have the ability to be able to. Next morning, you wake up refreshed. Immediately, you see exactly, you couldn't understand why you didn't understand it. But very often, sometimes, that you don't say, it's a level of discouragement. And that's all part of the evil inclination. You get frustrated. You don't go back to it. But if you go back to it, despite the difficulty, then you merit that divine assistance to be able to get it immediately. And it happens day in and day out, time and time again. This is almost like an ongoing process. Sometimes you have to take 2 steps back, then you go 5 steps forward. And if you have that experience, you understand it's not something which is unusual. Because Satan always wants to. The Satan always wants that the physicality should always have the upper hand. And if it does have the upper hand, it's inclined to something which is not what God wants. Because physically we're inclined to things, you want that sedateness, you want that comfort, you want that pleasure. And that's what life's all about. It's interesting, in the olden days, not too long ago, you had a situation called the old gold age club. People, they would work to 65, and until then, they made a lot of money. They traveled around the world. When they reach 65, they don't know what to do with themselves. They literally climbed the walls. The Talmud tells us that a woman in the home is a blessing. A man in the home is a curse. A man has to be productive. Sitting around doing nothing, you understand? His wife says, go play cards, go to the old age home, go to the club. Don't be at home. But the person works his whole life to arrive at this moment. Now what? It's the same thing. All your life, you're running after your tail, as they say. You're like a mouse on that treadmill. Today, treadmills are in the gym. The old days, mice were on the treadmill. But it's the same thing. People don't realize that the same mouse, you're just a bigger version of the mouse. Your mouse that has intellect, but where are you going? You never get off that merry-go-round. That's what it is. You need sometime that external infusion of clarity to understand where you're going. You're just going in circles. And most people, the circle may get wider, but you're still going in the same circle. We have to get out of that circle. You have to ascend. Ascending doesn't mean earning more money. Ascending means being more effective, being more accomplished. And even that, there's a question, what does that mean? For a Jew, it means a lot different than what it means for the world. And that you have to study. Ignorance is not going to get you anywhere. And ignorance doesn't exempt you from anywhere. Well, you could have had the opportunity to make yourself aware of what it is. But all these challenges are challenges that every person has to deal with every day. And if you understand what the objective is and what you have to accomplish, hopefully, being responsible, you will address and apply yourself in the areas where you should apply yourself. And that's the reality of life.